Hi, it's Dr. Ann Metz, and this is The Psychedelic Skeptic, where we believe that nothing is the cure for everything. If it's your first time here, I'm a licensed therapist, counseling professor, and in fact, a psychedelic therapist. But I'm also a skeptic when it comes to some of the claims around psychedelic medicine. And that's what I'm here to explore. Today on the show, when the trip doesn't end.
I was able to adapt to the HPPD because I kind of enjoyed the psychedelic mode of perception. I enjoyed listening to various psychedelic recordings. I enjoyed listening to the Beatles. But then as I became disillusioned with psychedelics, and as I moved on, and I've sought to create a new identity and a new set of interests that is not so centered around them, that psychedelic way of adapting stopped working.
I started this podcast to educate people about the risks of psychedelic therapy that often go unmentioned. Today, we're exploring hallucinogen persisting perceptual disorder, or HPPD. A word of caution. This episode contains challenging content that may not be suitable for all listeners, so please use discretion. Our guest today is Ed Prideaux. Ed Prideaux completed a master's degree in psychology at the University of East London in 2023. He previously led operations part-time at the Perception Restoration Foundation, an HPPD harm reduction and research center. He's also written for publications like the BBC, FT, Vice, The Guardian, New Statesman, and others. I actually found out about Ed's work through Jules Evans's Challenging Experiences project, where he's published on HPPD and other adverse experiences that people can have with psychedelics. In this episode, Ed will explain HPPD, share a bit about his journey with the condition, discuss its diagnosis and some of the treatment challenges. We'll also talk about the neurological aspects of HPPD, its potential causes, and the difficulties faced by those who experience it. Join us as we shed light on the significant but overlooked risk associated with psychedelic use. I wonder if you could explain to our listeners what HPPD is.
HPPD stands for Hallucinogen Persisting Perception Disorder, and that's the name given in the DSM-5 to a rare and exotic neuropsychological condition in which people, after consuming drugs, primarily psychedelics, but also a range of other drugs, experience the onset of visual aberrations that are associated with or reminiscent of the psychedelic drug state. So, for example, someone could take a dose of LSD and then, for years afterwards, still experience flashes of colour, illusions of movement, geometric patterns, static, suspended in the air, the visual snow phenomenon. And HPPD might not be that uncommon. The evidence we do have, which is relatively scant, suggests that some kind of persisting visual perceptual aberration might be relatively normal. Maybe it's that someone who's tallied a few trips, or they've maybe notched up a lot of trips, they might notice once in a while that their vision gets sometimes a little bit trippy. And that's okay. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But it does indicate that their visual perceptual faculties have been altered through chemicals. The actual HPPD phenomenon, however, in the DSM-5, is distinguished by the presence of clinically relevant distress and impairment. So, for instance, you could end up like an individual I named Stan when I covered his story for an article in Mad in America, and he might be representative of as many as 1 in 25 psychedelic users in terms of the presence of a visual perceptual condition with distress. And that 1 in 25 figure comes from a study from 13 years ago by Dr. Matthew Baggott, based on a survey of over 2,000 people on Erowid. But anyway, Stan represents perhaps the extreme end of HPPD, in that after a series of ill-advised LSD experiments whilst only about 13 years old, developed severe HPPD that decades later have still not remitted. And I asked Stan, who is unemployed and who struggles deeply with any kind of social interaction because of the extremity of his visual condition, who is forced to live on government welfare, and who has tried all sorts of interventions, both standard Western pharmacological, even shamanic and energetic kind of interventions without success. What he sees when he wakes up in the morning, and the first thing he described seeing was, quote, billions of fucking dots everywhere. Flashes of lightning bolts on his bathroom tiles. Striking visual hallucinations or pseudo-hallucinations, depending on how technical we want to get, to the point where his life was completely debilitated. Or you could end up like a man named Jay, who took a microdot of LSD at Glastonbury in 1995, the British Music Festival, along with some dose of MDMA, as well as smoking cannabis, and then months later, years later, was still experiencing intense strobing in his vision. I think he suggested it was 8 or 9 times a second, geometric patterns, intense after images, to the point where he cannot drive, he cannot operate heavy machinery, he's unable to socialize in a conventional way. I recall that he mentioned he has to even take Klonopin before making the simplest phone call even to his parents, because he is so distressed and overwhelmed by the constant visions. Or you could be someone like me, who might be someone in the middle. I took an analog of LSD, called 1P-LSD, when I was 17. I took 200 micrograms with a couple of friends, and I had a mixed experience. It was only a weekend after I'd taken 2 tabs, so I was in quite an impulsive adolescent phase of psychedelic experimentation, and then I duly noticed in the days afterwards that my vision was not quite as it was before. So I was noticing the visual static phenomenon, I was noticing the blinds in my classes, my lessons at school, because I was only 17, were moving and melting. I began noticing after images, so I'd look at something and look away, and I would see a faint, not even necessarily faint actually, sometimes quite a striking, almost transfigured replication of that image when I looked away, which can sometimes be of quite a striking level of detail. Remember when I would have very noticeable HPPD symptoms, I would look at someone's face and look away and look at a wall, and it would be their face in a brilliant white, and usually with a kind of pinkish hue, the particular features, down to the location of the mouth, the nose, the eyes, the hair, any kind of clothing, lasting for several seconds. I had symptoms of varying intensity for about 5 to 7 years, and then it started to remit, and then I decided rather foolishly to start experimenting occasionally with cannabis, and then that would always reignite the symptoms, to the point where I have had to wear, for instance, sunglasses, because the light sensitivity is another thing with HPPD. Everything is so damn bright. The high definition that you can sometimes get with psychedelics, the high definitional vision, seems to have lingered for many people. So that's HPPD. And there are all sorts of biological, psychological, and social factors at play with how the clinical condition comes about.
So this is a research interest of yours on one hand, but then it's also something that you've dealt with for many years in your life. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your process with it.
Yeah, so I, for a while, was kind of full-time HPPD guy, as it were. So I was working part-time for the Perception Restoration Foundation, which is founded by 2 people with HPPD, to try to raise awareness and fund research into HPPD. And then I was also doing a master's degree, for which my dissertation thesis was about HPPD. I was also making media appearances and writing articles on HPPD, and so my life was revolving around HPPD while still having it, and necessarily living it. And it did get too much, which is why I decided I didn't want to do a PhD, why I didn't want to keep working for the foundation, and why the activity I pursue on HPPD has slowed down significantly. Because I noticed that when I was doing my master's thesis, which was almost taking a CBT analysis of HPPD, viewing it as analogous to various other somatic symptom disorders, in which people, through a fairly predictable, regular series of cognitive behavioral patterns, become very anxious around a particular somatic symptom, whether it's some pain, real or otherwise, tinnitus, for instance. And HPPD is quite analogous to this when it becomes a distressing phenomenon. But anyway, I began noticing that the cognitive behavioral phenomena I was describing, like certain displays of catastrophic thoughts, fixation, hyper-monitoring behavior, obsession, were just starting to filter into my own life. Because I was editing spreadsheets on it all day. I was creating a survey about it all day. I was reading research about it all day. And so it began to rub off in a quite distressing way. But in terms of what I found that helped me, one, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend, was that, as I mentioned, I was still quite into psychedelics. So within a year and a half of that last dose of LSD, I took a proper dose again because I simply liked being on LSD. I found it very fun, and then did it a number of times in my second year of university. I was able to adapt to the HPPD because I kind of enjoyed the psychedelic mode of perception. I enjoyed listening to various psychedelic recordings. I enjoyed listening to the Beatles and feeling thrust into almost like a flashback state. I enjoyed being able to not merely recall nostalgically my trips, but actually, in a sense, relive them. But then as I became disillusioned with psychedelics, and as I moved on, and I've sought to create a new identity and a new set of interests that is not so centered around them, that psychedelic reinterpretation, that psychedelic way of adapting, stopped working. And now I'm in a very ambiguous place with them, where I just simply try not to notice them, and I've just had to accept them, and accept that I actually don't like the visuals. I suppose another one was also having a support network, as it were. My girlfriend is in the other room. She's known about the HPPD since before we even met. Whereas for years, I kept it to myself. So for about 5 years, I was almost completely dealing with this by myself. Maybe I think 5 people knew, all of them from school, of whom only 1 or 2 actually knew what the hell I was even talking about, because they were the 2 people that I'd taken acid with. And even then, they didn't think it was that big a deal. They didn't understand why it would be, even if it was occasionally enjoyable, why it would be alienating to constantly be living in a different reality. And I don't know what kind of amazing cognitive dissonance was required, or what amazing acting was required for me basically to seem fairly normal for all this time. But she knows, my family knows, at least some of my family find it quite amusing that I have this condition and have done all this messaging about it. And I'm able to take it on the chin because I'm not debilitated like Jay or Stan are. I'm pretty okay with it, but I have been most debilitated by a sort of cousin condition of HPPD called depersonalization, derealization, which has been actually something of a core focus of the Challenging Experiences project, because it's been a neglected area of discussion in terms of post-psychedelic difficulties, but it's a serious one. I mean, it came up with the case of that pilot, Joseph Emerson, because he was in an acutely derealized state after taking psilocybin. And derealization very often co-occurs with HPPD, and it's actually not uncommonly the more distressing part of it. People can adapt to visuals. It's harder to adapt to a condition which tangibly and viscerally gets you to question the reality of your own existence and the reality of the world around you. The very apparatus with which you could adapt is subverted with derealization.
Just for folks who are listening, depersonalization and derealization are 2 very serious adverse experiences. And correct me if I'm wrong on this one, Ed. So I think about depersonalization as the idea that reality exists, but that you are not sure of your own personhood. There's a reality out there, but that you don't really know or trust that you are a being in it, that you might be in the mind of some other being. And then derealization is where you're not sure that reality exists, but that you know you exist, and that you sometimes believe that all that is an extension kind of your own consciousness. Would you have anything to add or change about that?
Yeah, that's a good summary. I suppose they can take a variety of different forms. Someone with depersonalization could experience their sense of personhood as being threatened or destroyed by feeling like they're a robot, like almost witnessing the mechanical robotic quality of their interactions. And this is something that, for instance, Timothy Leary experienced in a very vivid way the first time he ever took LSD. If you read the details of that first trip, he witnessed the very robotic, entirely conditioned, and quite sort of behaviorist way in which he was basically acting with his daughter. The prescribed ways in which he communicated, the prescribed ways in which he respond, in language that he termed as games. Like he said that all human communication, all human culture, all human language is essentially a game. And he witnessed that, the gamified element of his communication, and felt himself as a robot. And so you could argue that he was in a depersonalized state, but equally, people might have a form of depersonalization that they actually seek to pursue, like in the doctrine of no self in various strands of Buddhism, that they actually seek to become depersonalized, to witness the purportedly illusory quality of the conventional self. And there was quite a good Atlantic piece a number of years ago called Enlightenment's Evil Twin, which analysed that quite tense, fraught balance between exalted spiritual states and then the distressing psychopathological counterpart. And equally, with derealization, it could be a kind of solipsistic condition in which people feel that the only person alive is them, but it can take a specific flavour of feeling like one is in a dream, which is the one that I had. It's not that I was genuinely speculating or ruminating on the possibility that I was asleep and dreaming or in some kind of otherworldly dimension, but I just generally, the world had lost in a deeply tangible, felt way any sense of being real. That began actually way after the HPPD. I'd read, obviously, about the possibility of DPDR, as it's called, through the various online forums and communities about HPPD, but I didn't get it. But then it happened gradually and then rather suddenly, and I was in my third year of university amid a period of quite chronic stress, and it began with the world seeming a little bit funny, walking down the street and you suddenly notice the sheer bizarreness of urban civilization. It starts off with this kind of like psychedelically playful sense of the manufactured fictional quality of social reality, but then it quickly becomes, is my own reflection even real? Am I actually real? What am I? Am I some kind of projection? And then it came to a head in an episode I talked about in a piece for Filter magazine, which is a magazine focused on harm reduction around drugs. And essentially, after a massive LSD flashback in a job interview that evening, I had an incredibly acute episode of derealization in which I literally lost any felt logical somatic connection to any kind of sense of self or reality, and my consciousness did seem to be leaving my head, and it was a direct experience of the slight depersonalization, derealization I'd experienced on an earlier LSD trip, in which my consciousness seemed to be leaving my head, or at least that the sense of consciousness being centered around the head, that were kind of behind the eyes. That sense was, the image that came to mind in the LSD trip was that the consciousness was barraging towards the grass below me like a ship mooring in a harbour, something along those lines, like it was just leaving. I was levitating off my body, and that was continuing to happen. And the way that I've made sense of this is to use an analogy that I see people use around the benefits of psychedelics, which is that you can imagine various patterns of thought and behaviour and habit as like grooves on a plane of snow. You go down these tracks of snow, and then the psychedelics kind of blow the snow over, so you're less grooved into these particular habits of thought. But for me, an image that makes sense is that having a number of psychedelic experiences at a young age created certain deep set grooves in my psyche towards dissociative hallucinatory states that I was liable to re-enter under the later application of chronic stress. Like the way that I responded to chronic stress was through a psychedelic dissociative episode. And I can talk about how I recovered and how people might tend to recover, but my story is very personal and peculiar to me, actually.
Yeah, I think there's so much that I want to explore, and I certainly think that the recovery piece of it is huge, but I also want to just maybe highlight for a second before we move to that, the point that you made about consuming psychedelics at an early age. And certainly in the research that I have done and the people that I've spoken with that have HPPD, that seems to be a really important piece of it, that exposure to psychedelics when you still have a developing brain seems to be a particular vulnerability. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I should probably have brushed up on this before the interview, but in terms of the specific figures from my thesis, but if I recall correctly, I believe it was around half of the sample had developed HPPD. This was a sample of about 450 people had developed HPPD at or under the age of 18. And I believe some non-trivial percentage, I can't quite remember, I'm sorry, of something like 12.5% maybe, had developed it at 13 or under. Shocking figures. And yes, I believe that adolescence is perfect as a biopsychosocial point of vulnerability for a number of reasons. There's the biological component, which is that you have a developing brain, and then shocking it with high doses of extremely provocative chemicals can, frankly, and this is language that people can be terrified of, it can alter your brain in a lasting way. On the one hand, that's kind of what we want from psychedelics. We all remember the famous Carhart-Harris nut study, which had headlines like "Psilocybin liberates the depressed brain." So we acknowledge that psilocybin and psychedelics have lasting impacts on the brain, and even in a visual way, in a positive way. Like I've heard people actually curing their colorblindness through LSD. I've heard of people developing lasting increases in their visual acuity through taking psychedelics. I've heard of people even recovering from HPPD through psychedelics. So shocking the brain with psychedelics has impacts on all sorts of cognitive, emotional, affective, perceptual faculties in the brain. I think that the social element, I think, is interesting because so much of the HPPD experience is this claustrophobia of isolation. And isolation you're especially liable to experience when you're still at school, because at least with the quite strict Roman Catholic school I attended, this is something I wrote about in my piece for Mad in America, the critical psychiatry publication a few years ago. You could be abhorrently racist to another pupil and you would get maybe a detention. If you were to bring in a small amount of cannabis, you were instantly expelled. And so if I was to confess even to my favourite teachers, I made a mistake, I've taken LSD, and my vision is warped, I don't know what's happening, I think it's HPPD, I would be expelled. Especially since my behaviour was already pretty poor. I think that I would have been expelled, and that was obviously a disincentive for opening up. I didn't want to tell my parents because my parents had actually caught me on that fateful acid trip, on the tail end of it, and threatened to call the police. And so there was a disincentive to open up on that front. And also that young people are generally not particularly emotionally competent at handling sort of tragic developments, like the possibility of a lifelong alteration to your vision. And so they're not really that present either. So socially, you're very liable to be withdrawn, and that can have a direct cyclical effect with your visions, as it were. Because the more you're isolated, the more you're liable to enter into the solipsistic headspace that can fuel derealization. Because you're literally just spending all day ruminating in your head about how much of a freak you are and how your vision separates you from everyone else. And your world does look different from everyone else, frankly. You will be in the same room as 15 other people, as I was at university often, and my vision would be almost a firework display of perceptual symptoms. I was in a different reality. And the more I isolate and the more I ruminate, the more I focus on the symptoms, and therefore the more intense they become through the power of attention. I think that psychedelics in adolescence, it reminds me of, I think it was Kranzner. He had 4 laws of technology. And one of them was technology is neutral and not neutral at the same time. That is, that the introduction of a technology is profoundly ambiguous when it being introduced to society in terms of its effects, and it can be used for good or ill. But at the same time, an internet-based society is very different to a book-based society. It's not neutral. It introduces a certain ideological set of assumptions that change the way people communicate. And so by analogy, taking psychedelics in adolescence, it can go wrong, it can go badly. You can exploit that psychological plasticity in a good way. It could be that someone was perhaps raised in a fundamentalist religious household in the American South, and then they spontaneously decide to take some of the mushrooms they find growing around Louisiana, and they experience a profound sense of liberation, a profound insight about the possible flaws in the worldview in which they've been indoctrinated, and opening their personality. And that's precisely because they're young and because they're adolescents, that they're open to something profoundly new. But at the same time, it can go wrong in the other way. But I think also that taking psychedelics at a young age is liable to push people along a particular pathway. People who take psychedelics at a young age are maybe likely to have been and to have become certain kinds of people, maybe a bit further out, higher in trait openness, etc. I think that the psychedelic experience can almost be viewed as like an intensive 12-hour training in particular ways of engaging your vision, which is why it can then become HPPD, but also a particular 12-hour training in intense emotion, in euphoria, and in these dialectics of euphoria and also depression and paranoia and anxiety. And I would speculate that's why psychedelics do seem to have a particular relationship with bipolar. And I would even speculate for myself ways in which I've become profoundly emotionally sensitive in ways that I perhaps wouldn't have been without having taken psychedelics, liable to enter into states of euphoria listening to music, but also becoming incredibly down in the dumps sometimes in ways that don't seem to be entirely normal.
So it almost amplifies what's already there rather than thinking about it as a way of regulating.
Yeah, I suppose so. But again, psychedelics are so ambiguous that they could. I can imagine they could narrow the intensity of people's emotional cycles, whilst for others that they could amplify them. But yeah.
I love the technology metaphor that you just used about how technology is ambiguous and not ambiguous. As we're moving into a psychedelic world, which is ambiguous and not ambiguous, what do you foresee unfolding?
Well, for one thing, I think that my experiences with psychedelics have involved more negativity than most people. And so I have a tendency to maybe be a bit biased towards negative. So I'll start with, I think many people are going to have some quite interesting experiences and some quite profoundly healing experiences in a way that's great. Whenever I get too skeptical, I just remember that footage that was released as part of How to Change Your Mind, I think it was, of that veteran, was it, who hadn't looked at his own reflection for years. And then under the influence of MDMA, he's finally able to look at his own reflection and experiences a profound breakthrough. That's clearly incredible. In the right hands, psychedelics have obviously had the power to be profoundly helpful. In terms of the impact on our broader social environment, in terms of the effect on society, I am wary of the way in which psychedelics seem to be so beloved by certain individuals I don't necessarily trust, like Elon Musk, Sam Altman, various Silicon Valley captains.
RFK Jr.'s people.
Yeah, Silicon Valley captains of industry, where it seems that psychedelics are so adaptable and ambiguous in terms of the experiences they can provoke, the kind of ideologies that they seem to provide spiritual rationale for, that someone like Elon Musk, can take LSD, ketamine, and psilocybin, and perhaps DMT, and it only seems to ratify and confirm his worldview. In fact, it charges it with a transcendental sense of mission. At the same time as poverty and inflation and various chronic social problems are blighting the actual people on this planet, his psychedelic experience has no doubt influenced what he tweeted a number of years ago, which is that he believes that we need to bring the light of consciousness to the stars. So it can take what is quite problematic statement on this worldly political terms, and it can paper over the gaps in reasoning with appeals to emotion and a sense of transcendence and rapture that we see in all forms of conventional religion. I think that psychedelics are vulnerable to the flaws of religion, which is the papering over of gaps in reasoning with powerful appeals to emotion. And the other thing that maybe worries me a lot is the way in which psychedelics are presently and are going to become predominantly just a kind of release valve for a profoundly desacralized and disenchanted capitalist society. We live in a world stripped of meaning through relentless commodification and through chronic economic precarity. And so people necessarily feel this sense of a lack of meaning. We hear people talk about the meaning crisis. And, wouldn't you have guessed it, capitalism can resell you a drug that will, for 12 hours at a time, provide you with the experience, with the T and the E capitalized, that will rapidly re-inject your sense of the world with a sense of the sacred. And it seems like the sacred is quickly becoming a sort of universal commodity, which is sellable to everyone in much the same way as, the mystical experience was. It's, don't mention God, don't stake your metaphysical flag in anything too particular, just say the sacred. And I think that psychedelics can also filter into this language of the existential in a way that's not necessarily helpful. There's a really good blog called The Failed Buddhist, which I'd recommend listeners check out. And he talks about the problems with so-called existential anxiety, with the whole language of the meaning crisis, the whole ideological approach of, okay, we're living in a disordered world, and so we need to get down to some sense of the fundamentals, the spirit, the sacred. We can solve the problems by going deep down into the source, which is the spiritual. That's the prescription. So you'll have people like Jack Kornfield, the Buddhist meditation practitioner, who says, we're living in a profoundly chaotic and anxiety-inducing world, so we need to build up a sense of resilience and solve the existential anxiety, which will enable us to be adaptable to all sorts of stresses in the everyday world. And psychedelics can often be part of this language of the existential. But the problem is there's no neutral sort of existential. There's nothing that's actually separate from the ideological day-to-day. Because in order to access Jack Kornfield's programs and prescriptions for existential anxiety, you need to pay several $100s, if not thousands of dollars, to go to his meditation retreat. And to the extent that you have this existential resilience and adaptability, you're simply enabling the relentless forces of modernity to continue attacking you. It's not solved anything.
The Psychedelic Skeptic was created by me, Dr. Ann Metz, with production help this week from Jesse Dukes and Andrew Merriweather. Our podcast music is by Wes Swing. The Psychedelic Skeptic is available on your favorite podcast app, and you can learn more about me at annmetz.com, or you can follow me on Instagram at Dr. Metz. If you want to recommend a guest for the show or ask a question about psychedelic therapy, feel free to send me a note at hello@annmetz.com. I'll see you next time.